Hello, welcome to the first presentation tutorial for opera. I probably will be talking you through all of these Prezi presentations just to amplify a little bit on the material, but you really have to go through and listen to them again because I'm not going to play the music or the excerpts, which is a great feature. It sounds terrible when I try to record. They just play through my speakers on the computer, so I'm not going to even subject you to that. So you'll go through and listen again. But this first time through, I also want to just talk about Prezi a little bit. If you're not familiar with it, it's a great tool. It's better, I think, than more flexible than PowerPoint. So you use the arrows on the right side of your keyboard. The right arrow moves you through to the next, to the sequence that I've designed. The left arrow can back it up. You can use the up arrow to zoom in, the down arrow to zoom out, and all of these I think will be helpful for you to enhance your understanding the material and the way you experience it. So let's get going. So this is opening presentation is about the origins of opera in the 16th and early 17th century Italy. The great musicologist F.W. Sternfeld wrote a book called The Origins of the Birth of Opera from the Spirit of Humanism. Humanism has to be understood as the sort of intellectual field on which that opera could emerge. And it led to a lot of different developments that are crucial. One is increased court presentations and entertainments, often very lavish and expensive, called intermedi. They're an immediate precursor to opera. The most specifically humanist endeavor that engendered early opera is the belief that Greek tragedies were sung throughout, which there's some justification for that belief. And in the late 1600s, a group of scholars and musicians in Florence wanted to recreate Greek tragedy, as recreating all things Greek were a driving force behind Renaissance culture. And then the other, specifically musical genre of singing, the madrigal, very important for the singing style that developed to what we now is still the basis for opera to this day. All right, let's back up and look more closely at the intermedi. So Prezi takes you to this little constellation of images which can have specific definitions. You can zoom in and read. So we see that they're their theatrical performance. It's usually allegorical. I've put in some definitions in case you're not familiar and need reminding about what an allegory is. An allegory is as far as theatrical presentations are concerned, it presents characters that are overtly symbolic or personifications of ideas like love or virtue. And they were the most important form of drama in the Renaissance and early modern period. Not true today, but very important for the development of early opera. And the intermedi, as you can read here, are these court entertainments, not that long, that would be performed at the intermission or in between acts of a play. But they could be extremely elaborate. And they are a precursor for the English masque. And of course it has all the show and the theatrical accoutrements of opera. The stage spectacle, the costumes, the singing, the dancing, etc. Here's a woodcut from an early intermedio. Music composed and libretto written by Peri and Rinuccini, who were first composers of the earliest operas. Now here is a YouTube uh, clip that shows a recreation of an early intermedi from the same time, 1589. This is a rebroadcast on Japanese television from a British original production, so that's why it has the Japanese super titles. If you read Japanese, you'll know what they're doing. Even without it, you can still see the allegorical characters there labeled. You see virtue, veritas, etc. And you'll also see the immense variety of instrumentalists, dancing, singing, that's going on. All right, so those are the intermedi. Now let's move over to Greek tragedy. Now this is really sort of the mind, the intellectual pursuit that drives the beginning of early opera, because this is where we have a fully sung drama, not just a spoken drama with musical interludes like the intermedi are, but drama sung from beginning to end, which is, of course, the most fundamental definition of opera. The group that drove this was called the Florentine Camerata. Camerata is basically a salon. And it grew out of the humanist interest in all things Greek and of ancient classical antiquity. So, a writer and early music theorist, Vincenzo Galilei, the father of the famous astronomer, developed a technique for singing that followed the principles of early Greek drama. As expressed by Plato, and those principles are laid out here. Text must be clearly understood, and most importantly, the words must be sung with correct and natural declamation. It's basically heightened speech. This is the basis for recitative, as we would call it now, and it was called stile recitativo then. Also, by another term, stile representativo, and are essentially called the acting style. That's what the author of your book, James Perakailas, calls it, and there's an excellent discussion of it in your text. The way text was presented was as monody, which is essentially a single musical line composed for one voice, accompanied by a simple bass line played by a cello or a gamba, and filled out, the chords filled out by a harmony instrument, such as in the early days, a bass lute, could be an organ, later would be filled out by a harpsichord. So the monody was especially suited for the declamatory recitative acting style, but it could also break into moments of what we would call song, metrically regular, more melodic, and this is Perakailas calls this the singing style. And because they're both accompanied by this simple bass line, the singers could jump between one and the other, the acting style or the singing style. The clearest distinction between the two is that the acting style is not metrically regular. They don't really follow a beat, and the bass line does not move in concord with the voice. In the singing style, they move in concord. It's more like you expect from music. The earliest operas. The first opera is from 1598 called Daphne. That was lost. The same composer and librettist Peri and Rinuccini composed in 1600 for the wedding of Marie de Medici and King Louis IV of France. They composed an opera based on the Orpheus story from Ovid's Metamorphoses. They call their opera Eurydice. That's Orpheus's wife. Ovid's Metamorphoses is the source for all the early operas. And again, your text has a very good discussion of this. Here you can see over to the left the published contemporary published version of this opera, and you see the simple melodic line in the voice and the simple bass line below. The prologue is sung. All these operas are introduced with a framing prologue. The character Tragedy steps out and introduces the opera. Again, you get to listen by just clicking on the YouTube. The second opera, or it's not necessarily, I think there was other ones in between, but another opera based on the Orpheus story is by Monteverdi, L'Orfeo from 1607, presented in Mantua, which is in northern Italy, not far from Venice. Again, you can see here the prologue in the monodic style, but this time the allegorical figure is music, which I think is significant. And I'm going to encourage you, give you a little extra discussion board in which I want you to talk about the differences after you've listened to these the openings of these two operas that compare the choice of choosing the allegorical figure of tragedy as opposed to the allegorical figure of music. A wonderful performance here. Oh, and by the way, let me back up here. So when I'm just going to play briefly at the beginning here. This will start up, and if you will zoom out, you can watch and also read the text at the same time. Or if you want, you can zoom back in. You can also grab your screen and move it around and zoom in as much as you want. Okay, so let's move on to the next, or the final important origin for opera is the madrigal. The madrigal is not a theatrical genre of music, but a secular vocal musical composition. Developed in the 1520s, tied to the expression of this rich body of Italian poetry, particularly from Petrarch. Unlike the monodic style, the madrigal is for more than one voice. It could be for one voice. It could be for as many as 5 voices. It could be unaccompanied, or it could be accompanied by instruments. So it's quite different than the monody. And it also is full of word painting and other things we associate with music. You want to find a good definition, it's right here over to the left. Monteverdi is one of the most important composers of madrigals, and it's not a coincidence that he also is one of the most important early composer of opera. The development of opera, earliest opera, entirely overlapped with madrigal, and madrigals and operas influenced one another. So madrigals began to incorporate the monodic style in them, as well as the more traditional madrigal form of singing. You also see other kind of musical things in madrigal that you would never see in monodic style, imitative counterpoint, etc. All of which someone like Monteverdi brings to bear and introduces into his operas, especially his later ones. We have here an excerpt from his Coronation of Poppea, composed in 1642. And this is a passage that is clearly owes much more to madrigal style. It's Seneca, a central figure, is forced to kill himself because he opposes Emperor Nero's plans to marry, and his followers entreat him to not do it. So it's a trio of male voices, and they sing in a clear musical structure with polyphony and instruments. Okay, enjoy.
Huh?